Did you know that the National Weather Service has a SWAT team? Well, not quite SWAT, but pretty close. Today, we talk with Robert Rickey. Robert is an IMET, an Incident Meteorologist. They are a group of about 100 forecasters who go to where the danger is. They primarily get deployed to wildfire events, but have worked on floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, and even oil spills. Their main goal is to provide weather information that keeps emergency responders, firefighters, and the public safe while adding valuable insight into the many pieces of the response puzzle. Robert joined the Incident Meteorologist program in 2017, and when he's not deployed, he serves as the Information Technology Officer at the National Weather Service's Flagstaff Weather Forecast Office. He started at the National Weather Service in 2011, and his military background well prepared him for his IMET assignments. A lesser-known but equally important duty that IMETs have is to provide real-time forecasts for prescribed burns, also called beneficial fires. These burns help mitigate the potential for catastrophic wildfires. Finally, we'll hear why Smokey the Bear is still right. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Kevin Peterson, and this is Weather Heroes. Robert, welcome to Weather Heroes. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I understand that you are an incident meteorologist, part of a dedicated team, kind of like the SWAT team for the National Weather Service. What does an incident meteorologist do?
The primary responsibility of an incident meteorologist is to keep people safe. So whether that's firefighters or members of the public, weather is a primary driver of fire activity. And so, to put it bluntly, people have died due to unexpected deviations in the weather. And so as an incident meteorologist, we're primarily being deployed to support firefighting operations. And we're there to make forecasts and brief the crews to let them know what the weather is going to be. Again, we don't want any unexpected weather to occur that could endanger the lives of our firefighters or the public. With that said, though, we make weather forecasts for fires. And in addition to that public safety aspect, our forecasts are used as tactical decision aids as well. So, people that are there designing operations to try to contain a fire are going to be using our weather forecast to make strategic decisions about what types of strategies that they want to employ in order to really stop the fire from spreading.
So set the scene for me. There's a wildfire somewhere in California, and the local folks are trying to figure it out. At some point, the state might get involved, even the federal government. And at some point, they call the National Weather Service and they say, hey, send one of the SWAT team members.
Yeah, that's right. So, we have there's a gentleman who works out of Boise, and his position is called the National Fire Weather Operations Coordinator. And what happens is these incident management teams will put in a request for an IMET, and that request will go to that gentleman in Boise. And then he's the one that makes decisions about who's going to be deployed. And so he'll always look at the local level first, right? So if there's a National Weather Service office in the area that the fire is burning, he's going to want to grab an incident meteorologist from that office because they're going to have the local expertise. They're going to have that great relationship with, let's say, the land management agencies in the area, with the local office. So he's going to try to grab that IMET. Now, sometimes that IMET's not available. And so he'll look a little bit, he'll look at like a regional level. He'll look for some surrounding offices and see if there's anybody available there. And if there's not, he may have to look nationally. I mean, we even have incident meteorologists that work in Honolulu. And sometimes when the season's really busy, we'll actually have to deploy folks literally from Hawaii to the continental United States to support fire.
What are some of the challenges that you find as a meteorologist when you're at that fire site and you're trying to make these predictions and give direction? What are some of the high-level challenges you face?
One of the biggest challenges is having a good internet connection. Like us IMETs, IMET is like that short-term name, the shortened name for incident meteorologist. Us IMETs are data hogs. We like to see our weather models. We like to look at satellite. We need to look at radar imagery. And a lot of these wildfires, they're in these very remote locations. And so it can be very challenging to get like a good, stable internet connection. Sometimes we're literally using internet off a like a hotspot on a cell phone. And so that certainly is a challenge. I mean, there's been times where I've had no internet and I've literally just been like, I need to drive down the road for an hour. I need to find a coffee shop with some form of an internet so I can get my job done. So definitely internet is one. The other big challenge is time management. I mean, we make these weather forecasts, but another big part of what we do is communicating the weather forecast. We need people to really internalize and understand that weather forecast. And so our day usually starts early. We'll get up in the morning, we'll do an operations briefing to let like all the crews know what the weather is going to be before they head out into the field for the day. After that, we may have an aviation briefing where we're briefing all the helicopter pilots, let them know, what the weather is going to be like that could impact air operations. We'll have briefings throughout the middle of the day, like called stakeholder meetings or cooperator meetings, where we're talking to ranchers in the area. We're talking to power companies, pretty much like any entity that's being impacted by the fire. If we can, we'll try to squeeze in a trip to the field to try to actually observe the fire, the terrain. That's super critical, and we're like really trying to make very dialed, specialized weather forecasts. Normally, we're racing back to our workspace after that to do a bunch more briefings, and by the time you know it, it's 10 p.m. at night and it's time to go to bed. And notice I never mentioned any time in there to actually construct the forecast itself, right? So you really have to be diligent when you're on a fire to just manage your time really well to get like all of those tasks done. Normally when we're on a fire, we're working 16-hour days. And those are long days, right? And that seems, that's a lot of work. That's many, many hours, but sometimes even 16 hours isn't enough to get all of, basically everything that we need to get done. So certainly time management's a big challenge as well.
What is a process where your forecasts get used to make decisions like evacuating people or where to fight the fire best?
Yeah, so I would say it this way, we're not necessarily the decision makers on the incident management team. We're providing that critical, like life-saving weather information. And then there's other folks on the fire that are then making those decisions about, do communities need to be evacuated? And so, a lot of those alerts are going to be coming from like operations on the fire. Each fire is going to have positions called public information officers or PIOs. And their job is really to supply the public with a constant stream of updated information. And so, they get that information out through press releases. They get that information out through their social media accounts. They'll put that information on the web. Wildfires may be impacting them. A great resource, I just want to get this out there, a great resource for folks is a website called INCIWeb. They can Google it. It's INCIWEB. And that website, most of the incident management teams are going to be uploading all of that critical information to that website. So that's really where anybody could go to get really the most updated information in terms of, that's coming out from these incident management teams on fires. From an IMET perspective, though, we are delivering alerts, but that's more kind of engineered for the firefighting crews themselves. For example, oftentimes, we may be dealing with thunderstorms near fires. And so I'll be watching radar throughout the day. When I see thunderstorms in the area, I'm going to jump on the radio and I'm going to let people know, hey, there's some storms traveling towards your area. You can have very heavy rainfall that could lead to flash flooding. So that is my kind of way of getting alerts out to crews in a timely manner to kind of warn them of some impending and dangerous weather that really could impact.
We hear about wildfires creating their own weather. Obviously, all that heat. Talk to me about what a large wildfire, what impacts does it have on the actual environment itself?
Yeah, that's a question. It occurs in a number of different ways. One way is that when you think of like a very, very vigorously burning fire, right? And that fire is heating the air above the fire to these really extreme temperatures, that hot air is going to be rising rapidly. And the atmosphere is like that. You can't have a vacuum. And so what happens is you start sucking air in from the periphery of the fire. So basically from all sides of the fire, you get this fresh inflow of oxygen to the fire. And that really allows that fire to breathe and allows that fire activity to pick up even more. So on a given day, maybe the atmosphere wants to produce a wind, a light wind from the southwest at 5 miles per hour, but if you're in or near that fire, you're going to be getting very strong, very, very erratic winds. That's one way. Another way, one that I think is a little more, we'll say it dramatic, is those clouds that form like in association with the smoke column. We call that pyrocumulus. And if we've got enough moisture and the fire is really vigorous, it'll form into something we call pyrocumulonimbus, which is a thunderstorm. And I've seen that happen. I worked a fire a few years ago in Prescott, Arizona, and we had a very vigorously burning fire, and we developed a full-on thunderstorm over the fire. We got a lightning strike out of it. We had even some light rainfall. And I know that the reason why we had that thunderstorm was because of the existence of that fire, because you could look at satellite imagery on that day and you wouldn't see another thunderstorm in the area for 250 miles. So certainly the fire had a huge impact on the development of that thunderstorm.
Talk to me, guys. You're being deployed. What does that deployment look like? You get that phone call from the guy in Boise, and he says, I need you to go out here to this wildfire for 4 days, and then you end up being there for 20 days. Or what does all that look like? Where are you living? Where are you staying?
For sure, yeah. So we get the phone call from the guy in Boise, and he basically says, like, if you're willing to accept this mission, I got a fire for you to go to. We say yes, and pretty quickly after that, we get a resource order. We get that resource order, it's time to go. Most of the time, that incident management team, by the time we received that resource order, wanted us there like yesterday. So we hit the road. We started mobilizing immediately. And, we have to travel, of course. Usually it takes an IMET about 24 to 48 hours to arrive on scene after we've gotten our resource order. And, and then it's on like Donkey Kong. We're working 16-hour days, especially if the fire is running and gunning. We're super busy. It can be very stressful at times. And like I said, a lot of these fires are in very remote locations. So, we're going to be sleeping in tents. We're oftentimes sleeping in the back of a truck, which is actually, in my opinion, a perk of the job. It does get you out to parts of the country you would never have gone to otherwise, right? So it's a pretty beautiful, pretty pristine areas. Not always like that, though. Schools are actually a very good location to set up what we call the incident command post on a fire. The incident command post, or the ICP, is, you could think of it as that's kind of the nucleus. That's where all of the kind of decision makers are going to be, all of the support personnel. So the people that are getting the firefighters paid, the finance section will be working there. The operations, the people that are making tactical decisions will be working there. That's where the IMET will be working, is at the ICP. And so a lot of times, again, those will be like at a school because it's the summer, so school's not in session. They're going to have a good internet connection, which is really critical, at this day and age. And so sometimes we'll just be sleeping on the floor in the rooms in the school. I've definitely done that before. Occasionally we'll sleep in hotels. Most of the time that's not the case. After COVID, that's become a little more normal. But again, most of the time these fires are in very remote locations. So even then a hotel wouldn't even be an option. Our deployments, the maximum deployment that we would is usually about 14 days. Although there is the potential that we could be extended for additional 7. So I have worked fires where I've been there for a full 21 days. So generally speaking, you don't really know how long that assignment's going to be when you're headed to it. They could last anywhere from as few as 1 or 2 days to as much as 21 days. When they're just 1 or 2 days, that's usually because of weather. So I've arrived on an assignment where we're literally getting heavy rainfall on the fire. And that just really tamps down fire activity. And then people can pretty quickly make the decision, we actually don't need all of this infrastructure. We don't need all of these resources. We can take care of this fire with a much, much smaller footprint.
So what would be the worst fire, or maybe the most dangerous fire you've ever worked?
The most dangerous fire, I go back to a fire I was on. It's called the French Fire. That was in 2021. And, I've been on fires where I've showed up and kind of most of the destruction, most of like the human toll occurred before I got there, really within the first like 24 to 48 hours. A fire occurs, the weather is just really bad. It's really windy, it's super dry, and maybe a community is devastated. And so I'll arrive and, and I'll see the aftermath. I'll see the burned homes, and it takes a toll, right? It's easy to empathize with people that lost their home. You think about losing your own home, and that's bad. The French Fire was a little bit different for me because in some ways it was like a catastrophe averted, but it was a catastrophe that played out while I was there over, a few day period. The French fire was a really interesting fire for me. It was in Southern California. It was in the Sequoia National Forest. And on one side of the forest, you have the Central Valley. They're in California, so it's kind of warm, it's humid. On the other side of the sequoias, you have the Mojave Desert. So think of Death Valley. It's super hot, super dry. And the differences in those conditions on either side of the Sequoia National Forest would lead to some pretty interesting weather phenomena. And one was almost like clockwork. You would see a wind shift that would occur. During the morning, the winds would blow from the east to the west, and in the afternoon, the winds would blow from the west to the east. And this was really important because there was a little community called Wolford Heights, and the fire was basically burning above that community. And when those winds would switch, it would push that fire directly toward the community. And so I arrive on scene and I'm doing my due diligence. I look at kind of the weather patterns in the area, and it's pretty obvious, right off the bat, I can see, hey, we're going to see this wind shift almost every single day. And pretty quickly, the fire gets established basically at the top of a drainage. And one thing I hadn't mentioned yet is that when I'm on a fire, I work very closely with another person on the fire. He's called the fire behavior analyst, or the FBAN. And their job is to take the weather forecast and use their expertise of the topography and the vegetation, their modeling, and they make decisions about what the fire is going to do. So, this fire gets established above the community in a drainage. And I looked at the FBAN and I said, what's going to happen when these winds shift tomorrow? And he's like, well, the fire's going to push toward Wolford Heights. And it really it hit me at that moment. This could get really, really, really real. People's lives can be impacted here. Of course, it was well known, evacuation orders, they got the people out of the community. And at the end of the day, it took firefighters working around the clock. I mean, there was firefighters that had probably been working more than 24 hours, literally to save the community, to prevent this fire from moving into Wolford Heights. At the end of the day, this heroic firefighting is what kept the community from really being burned over. There was I think there was just one structure that was lost. But, regardless, still, it has a toll on you. I consider myself lucky. The more you go to these wildfires, the more destruction you see. And it's whether or not you want it or not, you start to feel a little bit this extra baggage. So what I fondly now think about the French fire, because I think about a catastrophe that was avoided. It's baggage I don't really have to carry myself. And I get to think more about the heroic firefighting. But for me, the French fire was definitely one of the more kind of dangerous fires that I've worked in my career as an incident meteorologist.
There's a thing called a prescribed burn, which I know you get involved with quite a lot as well in your role as an incident meteorologist. What is a prescribed burn for the audience? Then what does that look like as far as your role is concerned?
So a prescribed burn, and honestly, probably a better name is beneficial fire. It's a tool that firefighters have to intentionally burn a piece of land to reduce the potential for larger and more destructive wildfires in the future. So it's preventative. And the idea here is that, the landscape, let's go back in time before there were human beings intervening. Fire was this naturally occurring process on the landscape, and it does a lot of wonderful things. One thing that it does is it prevents forest fuels, and when I say fuels, I mean vegetation, like dead vegetation. So pine needles, leaves, pine cones, stems, branches. It prevents all of that material from accumulating on the ground. And so what that would do is that reduces the severity of wildfire. Humans come along, start putting firefighters out, we start putting fires out quickly. And so what happens is you start loading up a lot of that dead vegetation. That vegetation, when it's dry, can produce very vigorous fire activity. I mean, it's basically what carries the fire. And so the idea with prescribed burning or beneficial fire is human beings can reintroduce fire to the landscape at kind of regular intervals. And we can remove a lot of that deadened down, a lot of that accumulated dead vegetation, and that can reduce the severity of wildland fire. And so perfect conditions are when you have a prescribed fire. Again, a beneficial fire is firefighters will go in there at the right time of year when the conditions are just right. They'll put fire on the ground, and that fire will basically consume all of those surface fuels, but it won't necessarily get up into the canopy of the trees. So you're not necessarily killing trees, you're just removing a lot of that kind of dead and down material that's, again, accumulated on the surface floor. So it's quite a bit different than wildfire, right? Because we're not responding to a catastrophe. We're like trying to prevent a future catastrophe, which is, that in itself is very rewarding for an incident meteorologist. But in some ways, working prescribed fire is a little more stressful. And that's because people have to make decisions about putting fire on the ground, and there is a liability there. If there's an unexpected change in the weather that causes the fire to move in some area that we don't want fire to be, that's really bad. And so there's always that additional stress involved where it's like, you want the forecast to be very good and you want the prescribed burn to be very good, because at the end of the day, human beings are actually making the decision to put the fire on the ground. It's not something that's just naturally occurring.
Yeah, I believe the lack of prescribed burns or beneficial fires over the last couple of decades is certainly a contributor to a lot of the fires we have today that are.
It is.
Yeah. Unfortunately. So in addition to wildfires, I understand you've also got involved with some flooding activity. So kind of like a different animal, obviously. So what would your role be as an incident meteorologist? What things are you looking for on a flood versus a wildfire?
Sure. So let me just start out by saying, that I have focused on wildfire, and that is primarily what incident meteorologists are supporting, but we have been deployed for a number of other types of disasters as well. For example, in 2003, the Columbia shuttle recovery, we had IMETs there. We had IMETs that were involved in 2005 with the Hurricane Katrina response. If you remember the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010, we had IMETs on that one too. And we've responded to other things. In 2011, there were some thunderstorms that went through Joplin, Missouri that really kind of devastated that community. And we had incident meteorologists there. So we do respond to many different types of disasters. For me, I had a deployment early last year in April. Usually the fire season around in the Southwest where I am doesn't kick off until around May, but I had this early season deployment to Tulare County, California, to support some flooding operations that were going on there. So it was actually pretty interesting. California has these state incident management teams. They're called CAL FIRE. And again, they're used to fire, right? That's what they respond to, but they were activated in order to basically manage these flood mitigation efforts. So it was something that was new to them. They're very adaptable people, they're professionals. And so they got in there and they were really able to get the job done. And they're used to rolling with an incident meteorologist, so that so they had an incident meteorologist with them as well. And it was different. One of the biggest differences is just the terminology. It's completely different than fire. I showed up and people are talking about these things called super sacks. There's talking about things called muscle wall and riprap. And I'm like, I'm a fish out of water. I'm like, I don't know what any of this means. Super sack, what is that? It's just a really, really big sandbag. I don't actually think they're filled with sand, but they're like giant sandbags. They're using helicopters to transport these around. They're using heavy equipment to put them in place. Muscle wall, that's like this giant plastic barrier that they were putting up along levees. They were putting up along riverbanks in order to prevent the water from overtopping them. I mean, I had to get used to that terminology. I had to get spun up on that really quickly when I arrived. Another thing too is the weather elements that they're interested in are not necessarily the same as fire. In fire, relative humidity is a big thing. Relative humidity, it to an extent tells you how vigorous the fire is going to burn. When you're dealing with flood operations, they don't really care about relative humidity. They want to know, is it going to rain again? Is it going to be heavy rain? Could that lead to more flash flooding? In this particular instance, there was literally historic amounts of snow that had fallen in the Sierras. And they want to know, are we going to heat up? Are we going to start melting that snow? Are we going to see all of that water start rushing down to these lower elevations? Another one that was super interesting was when the floodwaters were super high, there were still people that were trying to drive through them. And every day there were people getting stranded, right? And so, they had first responders out there and they were doing swift water rescues. And wind is important for fire, but it was super important for their operations as well, because there was so much water, there was so much runoff that, these basically we were developing a lake and we were getting waves. We were getting these wind waves, and that was hampering their ability to get out there and rescue people. So, instead of making a wind forecast to determine where a fire is going to go, I was making a wind forecast to try to figure out how big are these waves going to be, and is that going to hamper rescue operations? So definitely was a different animal. Super interesting experience, though.
I had never even thought about that, creating waves. I would have thought, oh, visibility and the obvious things, but that's very interesting. What do you think? Is there going to be any impact on the ENSO transition to neutral or maybe La Nina on the work that you do on the fires and floods and everything else?
El Nino and La Nina are predictors of future weather. I mean, they are, but there are many different factors. Okay, and to put things into perspective, in the Southwest, where I am in here in Arizona, on average, when we're in La Nina periods, we tend to have less precipitation. Well, last winter, we were in a La Nina, we were in a strong La Nina, and we had almost historic amounts of snowfall across the higher elevations of Arizona. Here in Flagstaff, we were close to record amounts of snow, and our records in Flagstaff go back to 1898. So I have to say that right off the bat, just to say that there's a lot of variability, okay? But on average, when we're dealing with El Nino conditions, we tend to have, we'll say, wetter conditions across like the southern parts of the United States. So across the Southwest, into Texas and portions of the Gulf Coast. And the northern half or northern portions of the United States, they tend to have a combination of like drier and warmer conditions. And drier and warmer conditions tend to lead to more fire activity. So on average, when we're dealing with El Nino conditions, because of the warmer and drier weather, you tend to expect more fire activity across like northern portions of the United States. And then that's basically reversed. So during La Nina periods, you tend to have warmer and drier conditions across southern portions of the United States. So again, across like the Southwest United States, across Texas, across parts of the Gulf Coast, with a combination of like cooler and more wetter conditions across the northern parts of the country. So again, on average, when we're in La Nina periods, you tend to have increased fire activity across basically the southern part of the United States. And so that's that correlation there. And so we will use like these El Nino and La Nina cycles to basically forecast the future. It's about how to stage resources. Where should we have firefighters ready, and mobilized to? And to an extent, we are going to be looking at these like El Nino and these La Nina patterns. But again, there's other things like the condition of the fuels or the conditions of like the vegetation and things like that also have like an outsized role when it comes to like new fire starts and fire activity as well.
So, Robert, is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you think that our listeners would like to know about incident meteorology overall, or your role, or really anything about the National Weather Service and what y'all do?
One thing that I want to mention is that the overwhelming amount of fires are caused by humans. I think it's like 85 to 90% of wildfires are caused by humans. So that's things like discarding a cigarette butt inappropriately. That's an unattended campfire. That's someone who's overheating, pulls over to the side of the road into like some tall grasses and starts a fire. It's arson. So humans are responsible for the vast majority of wildfires, and those are the preventable ones. We don't have much control over the lightning-caused fires, but we do the human-caused fires. So something I do want to stress is that it's really important that people are careful around fire. If we can prevent wildfires, that's the bulk of it right there, right? Then you don't need to mobilize this massive response, and we'll have much less of a human toll. So I did want to convey that you don't want to mess with fire, that people really need to be careful around fire. I think that's just extremely, extremely important.
If you have any final message, I think that was probably a pretty good one. Pay attention to Smokey the Bear, basically.
Right? Only you can prevent forest fires.
That's right. So, Robert, thanks for joining us today. I'm really excited to have the audience get a chance to listen to the information you shared and some of the wisdom. So until next time, thanks, and signing off for Weather Heroes.